Hello, everybody. Welcome to the summit. I'm Mark Coleman, and I'm here with Michael Yellowbird. Perfect person to be with because it's Earth Day. So happy Earth Day and welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to be with you. So Michael Yellowbird, MSW PhD, is the Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. He is an enrolled member of the MHA Nation, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara in North Dakota. Dr. Yellowbird's research focuses on the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, ancestral health, intermittent fasting, indigenous mindfulness, neurodecolonization, mindful decolonization, and the cultural significance of res dogs. He is the founder, director, and principal investigator of the Center for Mindful Decolonization and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. He serves as a consultant, trainer, senior advisor to several BIPOC mindfulness groups and organizations that are seeking to incorporate mindfulness practices, philosophies, and activities to indigenize and decolonize Western mindfulness approaches to address systemic racism and engage in structural change. Dr. Yellowbird is the co-author of two recent books, A Sarnish Arikara Ethnobotany and Decolonizing Holistic Pathways Towards Integrative Healing in Social Work. That's quite an impressive bio, Michael. Welcome. It's great that you're here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction.
There's so much, there's so much in your bio I want to be diving into, but I've got lots of questions. At some point, I do want to hear about the res dogs.
Love to talk about res dogs. Yeah.
Okay. So, Michael, your pioneering work integrates indigenous wisdom with modern scientific approaches to health and well-being. Can you share how your heritage and research has inspired you to pursue the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I really think about it fundamentally as how I grew up on the reservation back in North Dakota in the USA. And my good fortune to observe a lot of the traditional kinds of practices and ceremonies, and those kinds of things that were sort of coming to an end at that point, but there was still a lot of conversation around that. And a lot of it was very, very earth-based, very, very connected to the land, very connected to the water, very connected to, our own life and our way of living. So that kind of was the impetus for me to begin to think about, the importance of how ceremony and how a particular lifestyle began to shape, the social relationships between people, between the land and people, between people and animals, and to kind of help carve out for them, their place and their understanding of their place, in this whole big sort of circle of life. So it was really fortunate, for me to be born into a family of healers, of prophets, of folks that were leaders, indigenous leaders in the tribes that we lived in, and that sort of put into motion for me that how important these things were. And when colonization arrived, colonization was the effects of colonization were to kind of remove people from those different kinds of positions they occupied in terms of our relationship to the land and the lifestyles we lived. So after many years of looking at that and thinking about why did people do what they did, and what purpose did it serve for their well-being and their health and their sort of their outlook on the world, I started to discover how a lot of Western science, especially in neuroscience, genetic sciences, molecular sciences, and cellular sciences, all seem to kind of be really good guideposts to kind of demonstrate how when people engage in certain kinds of traditional ceremonial practices, particular kinds of things begin to happen in the bodies and the brains of people that really helped create a sense of wellness. And so as I've looked at Western science and I've looked at ceremony of indigenous people, I've been able to kind of match those kinds of things that show that different kinds of activity taking place in our bodies that increased and reduced stress or it may, for instance, ceremony and being in collective groups, singing and dancing, all these things, raising endocannabinoids and raising the brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain, protected the brain, reduced pain, improved mood, and it raised the level of dopamine and the different, you know, oxytocin when people were doing it in groups. And then I start to discover that as I looked at this more deeply, that wow, these cultures were what we call collectivist cultures, and they had evolved to have a very strong collectivist relationship with one another. And so those markers were showing up in what they call serotonin transporter genes, and how those genes, really provided a way for people to be collectively working together. And then other ceremonies that people did made them more empathetic to animals, to the land, that sort of thing. And so when you see that, and the nucleus accumbens, for example, what we know in the research now, when we get shrinkage in the nuclear accumbens, then it's not all about me. It becomes more and more about us. And
Mhm.
so when you look at indigenous cultures, that's one of the things I've kind of come to understand is that it's not just like happenstance or it just happened spontaneously. These were things that people evolved to do, and of course, it affected their brain and it affected their collectivism and how they're together. So I took that indigenous cultural stuff, integrated it with Western science, and I began to find many really interesting points of mutual points of understanding and illumination, from these kinds of things. So
Mhm. Yeah, beautiful, very rich, and I love how much the science is really just pointing to what we know and what you know in your direct experience and what people have known for a long time. But it's always good to have the specific data isolating whether it's the neuro apparatus that's involved in these things. And um, so you've extensively researched the impacts of colonization on indigenous peoples, and also explored methods of decolonization. And I'd love if you can explain the main framework of decolonization from your perspective.
So yeah, Mark, that's again another great question. I think in order to begin to frame decolonization, it's really important for Indigenous people. It's really important to understand the experience of colonization, and not just talking. And I'm not just talking about like sort of the social and political aspects of it, but what happens to the biology when people are chronically stressed for long periods of time under kind of a colonial oppression and manipulation and control, where there's feelings of unsafety, uncertainty that extend for long periods of time. It's like occupation. Any
Mm,
population that's been occupied by an occupying force, when that occupying force can exert all kinds of power and control over this group, it leaves a lot of uncertainty, a lot of feelings of fear. There's the activation of the fight flight response, and so after many years of that, one of the things that happens kind of on the molecular level is we begin to see a shortening of the telomeres at the end of the chromosomes. That kind of stress causes that, degradation of that telomere at the end of the chromosome, which actually protects the chromosome, which is a good predictor of, whether or not when a person may get cancer or tumors or, heart disease or diabetes or any of those kinds of chronic diseases and disorders. It makes us much more vulnerable to those diseases of aging, that kind of stress. And so it has a direct, kind of effect on that. So I was thinking about that a lot, about what happens to us on that molecular and cellular level. We can see what happens to us, when populations begin to have, depression and anxiety disorders, and poverty creates that and whatever. But there's also the long-term effects that we don't see that happen at that very kind of molecular level, that cellular, that very deep level. And now we kind of understand a bit about that, because that research has been done. So when I think about that, I think about what do we need then to kind of move towards decolonization, of that body, of that brain, of those systems that are affected, the brain and telomeres and all these other parts apparatus that are affected by colonization. So what I've come up with is an understanding that of what I call neurodecolonization. So neurodecolonization is really understanding like how you can use contemplative practices, ceremonial practices, and align those with meditative kinds of things, and how you can use those to begin to restore and rebuild some of these things that have been affected by colonization and long-term chronic stress. We know now from Elizabeth Blackburn's work, she was, I think, 2015 Nobel Prize winner. She studied the telomeres, that there are certain kinds of behaviors, certain kinds of activities that people can engage in that begin to help restore the integrity of the telomeres at the end of the chromosomes to kind of, in a sense, reverse aging or reverse the stress that's happened. And for me, as I looked at a lot of the practices that were taken away during colonization, like the ceremony, the dancing, the singing, the collectiveness, the movement, all these different kinds of things that were really critical for indigenous people. Once those were taken away, disease and also these signals of decay to the body began to kind of take place. So we began to see a lot of diseases, and we still see those among indigenous people around the world. There's again the chronic disorders like heart disease, cancer, obesity, diabetes, all these different kinds of things. So that was all part of the colonization that happened to people at that, the out level, then sort of the internal level. So what did decolonization mean? Well, neurodecolonization then would be using these practices then to begin to at least, kind of understand, the effects of the colonization on the body, on our mind, on our emotional state, and then begin to kind of label those things, throughout practices to kind of come to understand, how we've been affected by that kind of thinking that sort of taught us to disregard and to trivialize and devalue our ceremonies, our songs, our relationship with the land. And so we kind of had to kind of do this purification and scrubbing around that to kind of figure what that is. So that's the first stage of decolonization for me, is understanding the colonization and what we need to do to kind of begin to remove some of those really harmful pieces. The next is to kind of shift in what I call the period of the Renaissance or Restoration, where people actually go back to some of those practices, the songs, the symbols, the ceremonies, the foods, the relationship with the land, and begin to re-engage in this process. They dig up even the prophecies of the people that make sense to whatever the group is. People engage in those kinds of things and begin to learn more deeply about that, meditate upon that. They develop kind of mindfulness and meditative practices around, recovering songs, recovering speech, recovering ceremony, recovering dancing, and all these kinds of things. So that's the next piece of decolonization. The third piece for me is what I call the period of enlightenment, where we begin to draw from everything that we know now in current society, that gives people, I guess, an edge against, those kinds of things, or the decay of society. So there's a lot of Western knowledge that goes there and science that goes there, a lot of indigenous knowledge and science that goes there. So it's a combination of those kinds of things that kind of help bring enlightenment to people. Whatever those technologies are, whatever those belief systems are, whatever those values are, those ethics are that we have to kind of move towards in a sense of futurity, in the sense of like seventh generations and even more ahead, we have to begin to look at those kinds of patterns in cycles of human beings and human processes on the earth in order to kind of reach that stage of enlightenment. And that's kind of, to me, where we engage in very, very deep kinds of ceremonial practices that are more enlightened and more engaging. But again, like the science supports it. We put in our 10,000 hours of practice before we start to, reach that point where, we become very endowed with that knowledge and that capacity to overcome some of those kinds of things and to think creatively and more innovatively. So, those are the kind of the three stages, that kind of purification stage, Renaissance stage, and the Enlightenment stage. So that's what decolonization means to me.
Mm, yeah, beautiful. And it's a beautiful map and pathway for the regeneration of so much indigenous culture that's been really violently oppressed, suppressed. I love the pointing to the inner work too, the neuro decolonization, which is such a interesting facet. There's the outer work that's very important, but also as you speak about the inner dimension. Yeah. I know your deep love of nature and the integration of nature into your work, and your work on ancestral health and indigenous mindfulness practices also suggest and point to this profound connection between well-being and our relationship with nature and the natural world. And I'm wondering if you can share some also of your research about how these practices, these nature-based practices and ceremony and whatnot affect the brain and can guide us towards healing ourselves and our communities.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've done with some of my work is really look closely at what ceremony does to the brain, especially
Mm,
ceremony in the outdoors or ceremony on the land.
mm,
And what I've stumbled upon has been influenced by other neuroscientists, like Andrew Newberg and by Richard Davidson and people like that who've kind of done a lot of brain imaging, when people are engaged in relationships, that are very stimulating and very sacred and mystical. And these mystical kinds of things happen. So what I've learned from some of the work of some of these other folks who are really kind of eminent neuroscientists, Western neuroscientists, is that in Andrew Newberg's work, for instance, he's looked at the brain's imaging of nuns and Buddhist monks and other sort of spiritual people that have had these really deep, mystical, transcendent experiences. And when they had that experience, it reminded me a lot of what was written about the Buddha when the Buddha first found enlightenment, and the Buddha was sitting under the Bodhi tree, and committed to stay there, until if he had to die before he reached this level of enlightenment. And kind of toward the end of his sit there, one of the things that he did when Mara, this sort of, this psychological kind of Mara was kind of talking to him about, um, you you how dare you try to be enlightened? Who do you think you are? No one's going to see what you're doing, that sort of thing. And the people that know the story know that what the Buddha did was he reached down and touched the earth, and he said, "This is my witness," right? As if the earth is a living thing. And his realization at that point, the Buddha could see a drop of water in the ocean, and he could see the whole ocean in a drop of water. He could see this, this dynamic connection that existed. So what enabled him to get to that level, and other people who've gotten to that level, be it Jesus or Buddha or whoever it is, it sounds to me like the part of the brain, the parietal lobe on the right side of the brain, goes offline. Well, the parietal lobe is very important, according to a lot of work that's been done, because it's also about visual spatial reasoning, about who I'm here and other things are out there, and it's also about three-dimensional, thinking and reasoning. That we see things in three-dimensional. When people get in a very, very deep sense of meditation, and they begin to have this sense of timelessness, spacelessness, and transcendence, we know that then they make a connection with where everything is all one. That's kind of what Newberg's research talks about. And I thought, wow, I wonder how that would look when we looked at indigenous people. So what I've done in my research, looking at other people's work, I looked at this guy Edward Curtis, who was a pretty well-known person who came to the West and Midwest of the United States to document the vanishing indigenous person. He called it the vanishing Indian. Thought we were all going to disappear, as modernity took over and civilization, we were all going to become extinct, which didn't happen, of course. But when he was taking pictures of people engaged in their ceremony, and what I heard about these ceremonies, well, I have a particular one that I show of his, one of his pictures where you've got a number of indigenous men, Arikara men, standing around a tree out in the middle of the Great Plains. So it's just this single tree that they've brought in, to the village, and they put, in the middle. And the tree represents a mother or a grandmother, and that's the kind of the bearer of life, right? The giver of life. So these men are engaged around this tree, singing to this tree. They're talking to this tree for hours and hours and days and weeks and months, and they do this, throughout the seasons of the year. And when they reach their 10,000 hours of practice, it's kind of been identified in this book called Altered Traits, by let's see,
Dan Goleman.
Goldman, yeah, and Richard Davidson. Yeah, it's like, okay, we know that the gamma wave begins to kind of become very apparent there, and then people enter into the state of transcendence, right? And so in this particular thing, when Newberg was talking about when we get to that state, we're one with everything. I said, well, this is what's happening with these men around this tree way back in the early 1900s in my village. they're singing to this tree becomes part of them at some point when their pride lobe goes offline. And all of a sudden, the distance between them and the tree shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until they're connected to the tree very intimately. As a matter of fact, they would be the fragrance of the tree. They would be the branches, they would be the leaves, they would be the roots, they would be, and the tree would be them. And so this is how we get back to the Buddha then, as I started telling earlier, is that once people reach that level of intimacy and time spent out in nature, that parietal lobe, as it goes offline, allows us to have this very dynamic, transcendent, mystical experience where we do actually feel like we are one with everything. And that seems to be consistent across all cultures, that practice this deep level of spirituality and ceremony. So that's one of the things that I've discovered in my work. I says, wow, this is what they were doing out there. And I've got a lot of other examples too that I talk about in some of my work. But that's the one that's always sort of that's really just captivated my interest the most, is seeing people actually doing that and actually understanding what was happening, not only from a sense of as an indigenous person about the words and the ceremony and the meaning of it, but when you look again at a brain image, how the brain image is helping, or how the that part of the brain, the parietal lobe going offline, helps to kind of bring this process along. It's pretty incredible. So
Mhm. Yeah, and how wonderful that we can begin to track that, the actual neurological impact of being outside in that sacred way or in ceremony, with awareness. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And as I mentioned earlier too, Mark, when a person begins to find that they are connected to everything like that, when they are, they're part of this, great circle of life, and the great circle of life feeds them and they feed it. It's so, it's such an intimate thing. That's when that part of the brain I was talking about before, the nucleus accumbens, begins to shrink. And I say, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about us. And the us can be the river. The us can be the mountains. The us can be, the trees. The us can be the grass. The us can be the earth and the atmosphere, right? And then that's
Mhm.
the transcendent part. I think that happens to people when they reach that level of enlightenment and awareness and insight. So
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, beautiful. So, in your book, Decolonizing Pathways Towards Integrative Healing in Social Work, you explore the intersection of healing, social work, and traditional environmental knowledge. And in these challenging ecological times, how can these healing practices help us meet the ecological crisis we're in?
yeah, again, I think it's really the book that we wrote. I put a lot of stories into there, into the book, and a lot of narrative story into the book to talk about how it did affect people on a very deep level. Who, in one case, I had an aunt that took me down to the river one time. We were talking about the trees and talking about water in my backyard, and then she said, "Come with me. I want to take you down to show you something." And so she took me down to in her pickup. I drove her pickup truck down to the water. We parked there, and she started talking about the water, how the water was imbued with spirit, right? And there were actually water spirits that watched over the water. She said, regardless of what other people think, this is our belief, Michael. You know that.
Mm,
I said, yes. And she said, it doesn't matter. She said, what matters is our belief and then our respect for this kind of thing, right? And so what she did, for me was to give me a lesson about this, right? A lesson I had heard before, but it was, you're never too old for a lesson,
mhm,
So she told me, like, and like, it reminded me, and that, of course, how many times I've heard stories like that. And then she did the ceremony for me, over the water, where she, took something from her purse, on her side. It wasn't like a normal purse, but it was where her medicine was. She took it out and she said prayers over the water, and she said, we have a relationship with the water. The water feeds us. It births us, and it also can take us. That's how intimate water is with us. And so we offer to this water, this gift. We offer to the spirits this gift, and something, she said, this is what we do at different times of the year when the seasons change, the water changes, right? And so those are the kinds of things that, just to visit to the water, to understand, your people's relationship with the water, how important it is, or the land. I've been taken on the land, and listen to the stories of my father telling about his grandfather, my great grandfather, and the time spent on the land. And those were the kinds of things, I mentioned res dogs earlier, where you mentioned res dogs in my bio, and relationship with animals is critical. We know now from research that being with animals, can really, really lower blood pressure, can really, really sort of, you know, uh, uh, lower heart rate, your metabolic rate, those kinds of things. It's we see that when in hospitals and clinics and hospices and in different places, where people are when dogs or cats are brought in, it changes the whole tenor and the environment of the place. I've seen it with I've worked with people who work with inmates and horses. You see the same kind of thing. You see people who are incarcerated populations begin to work with horses. It just completely sort of reframes a person's relationship with an animal, and then they have a responsibility and a connection. So there's two-way learning going on between the animal and the person all the time. There's two-way learning if we let ourselves kind of be on the land that happens between the land and us. There's a two-way learning that happens when we spend enough time around the water, that the water reveals itself to us. So that to me is kind of what we try to talk about in the book, and I try to give lessons in the book. I'll kind of give you one more example here. My second oldest son was riding a horse one summer when we were home. I was at my PhD program, so we went back to North Dakota from Wisconsin, USA, and he was riding a horse, and he was thrown from a horse. And that evening, after he was thrown from a horse, we got the horse. I went back and I told my father what had happened. And my father listened to this story. He said, you should go see his grandfather. His grandfather is a medicine man, and his grandfather knows the ceremony, how to kind of, make it right between the horse and the rider. So I did. The next day, my son and I drove over. We met his grandfather. He brought us in ceremony right away. He doctored my son, from the fall from the horse, so he wouldn't be afraid of the horse, so he would have, more insight on the horse and kind of, be more connected. And after that was all done, he said, now we have to go and see the horse. I said, okay. So we got in my truck and we drove all the way around the reservation. We got to where the horse was, and he talked to the horse. He doctored the horse, and he talked, and he said, "We got to take the trauma away from the horse. Something, happened to the horse." So then I thought he was done, and then he said, "Where did this happen?" I said, "Well, it happened down over here." So we had to drive a bit. We got down to this place where the trees were and where everything had happened. He said, "Now we have to take the trauma out of the land, and the trees and the grass and everything that's witnessed this." He said, "Trauma is, gets in the land." He said, "These things happen." So I thought, wow, I never heard that ceremony before, but my father had prepped me for it a bit. So he did. He walked around. He talked to the land. He talked to the trees. Talked to the grass, even some birds. He said, these birds, maybe where they were here or whatever. He said, they communicate. They see things that are going on. He said, these are the things we used to know, when we were before, colonization, and that we always have that kind of relationship with the land. He said, it's just like, a gate that you open. You have to close it. You have to open it. The land's
Mm.
like that. It's like you have this relationship. It's not just a one-way thing. And everything, is imbued and endowed with spirit and understanding, he said. And so that was the first time I'd ever seen someone, ever go to the land and begin to try to remove the trauma from the land. And because all this had happened in one place. So if you can imagine, during war times, when bombs are hitting the earth and blowing up buildings and blowing up the land and leaving all this waste there, how traumatized the earth would be. Again,
Yeah.
doesn't, to him and to me, it didn't matter whether or not people believed it or not. We believed it. And that's, the part that would activate certain parts of our brain that would sort of reduce our nucleus accumbens to say, it's not just about me and about the horse that my son got thrown and my worry. It's about everything here that's all involved in this, everything that happened. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the kind of thing, is to kind of think about, for me, it was to think about, how intimately we're, not, that we are relationship we have with the earth, but how many levels that exist that we need to kind of explore before we, it's like anyone that, any surgeon or anyone that's kind of looking for a disease in the body, they have to do a lot of exploratory surgery and examination before they find, okay, here's the bugger here. This is what's going on. Now we need to lift this off so the body can heal. It's the same kind of analogy, I guess. So
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, beautiful. I love that story. Just the different levels of healing, but also the sensitivity to the impact, in this case of trauma.
yeah,
So kind of following on that a little bit, in indigenous culture, that there's so much of what you're pointing to, what I understand is, the honoring of nature, the animal spirits, the land, the ancestors, all sort of intrinsic to indigenous wisdom. And for those of us who are not indigenous and yet feel drawn to study, to learn, to practice in some way or be informed by ancient indigenous knowledge for healing, personal, collective, what's the is there I'd love to hear your reflection on what's the either balance or what to be careful of in terms of cultural appropriation and how to engage in a way that's not appropriating but respectful.
humans are humans, right? So I think you can try to provide teaching, even provide you know guidelines and like don't cross this line kind of thing. But that's kind of been the nature of human beings ever since our evolution. 8 million years ago, we're people that migrate, we move, we explore, we test things out, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's without the knowledge of the people in the land or the knowledge of the land, those kinds of things, which has kind of brought us to where we are today as a society, kind of on the brink of a lot of you know catastrophic kinds of things that are some are actually happening now with climate change. So I think the thing is that a lot of indigenous people make this knowledge available. They write about it, they talk about it, they invite people in to come and learn about it because it's when you get down to the real core of indigenous understanding and belief. When you get past the politics and the past the fear and the past the mistrust, all those kinds of things. I think we all realize, at that level that we're all connected very intimately at some level, right? And we need each other, just like we need, the land and the animals, to survive. So I think when I think about, appropriation of indigenous things, I think that's the thing is that, it's really important to kind of talk with indigenous people, to get to know indigenous people in your area, to and to utilize, I guess, some level of ethics and caution when you're doing things, with folks. Um, and I've seen it for many, many years, Mark. I've seen where when I was a graduate student, a lot of people were appropriating Native American kinds of things. Even today, you can go into an airport and buy you know um, a dream catcher, right?
Mm-hmm.
That comes from the Ojibwe people, right? For a particular reason, or you can, see something there that's from maybe a Pueblo society or Lakota or, even, my people or something. Um, but it's there. People do that kind of thing. Uh, One of my son's grandfather who did the healing work used to always talk about how sometimes things are alive, if you've got sacred things and there's still life in them, but you have to, like anything else, you have to treat them in a particular kind of way to keep them you know um, inspired and alive, right? Even though they may look like an inanimate object, right? And so the belief of a lot of people was you feed these kinds of things certain kinds of you make certain kinds of offerings to certain kinds of things. And in that kind of, are people who have the good hearts who do those kinds of things, and they do it with a good will, right? And he used to always say that the land, the waters, the trees, they all know your heart, they know you, that sort of thing. So he said when people come to do it with good intentions, he said there are benefits and it's good. He said when they come with ill intentions, of course, you have things that happen, right? To people and to society and communities, that kind of thing, right? And that's where we kind of discovered, it's like the old Pandora's box. It's really colorful. We open it and we release those kinds of things, or whatever it is. But it's I think it's that thing. Always kind of keeping in mind that for people who are, I mean, the listeners, that indigenous people have been through a long, long period of colonization, a long, long period of loss and appropriation of things, right? And that's kind of really important to think. If people don't want to kind of continue the colonization, that thing is to kind of repatriate, back to them their dignity, their knowledge, their understanding of the world, and of course, be respectful, that kind of thing. And I think a lot of indigenous people, are happy to invite other folks in, as respectful guests and that kind of thing. And some endow upon them certain kinds of things they can do on their own and to practice, right, and to kind of help them individually. They don't always give something or endow something to someone to kind of take it, on the road, or to kind of make a living off of it or something like that. It's that's kind of the tricky part of it too, is that the people that who are offered in, hopefully 9 out of 10 of them will kind of be respectful and not appropriate, but and also continue to have a strong relationship with indigenous people and give back. That's what indigenous people. It's always about kind of mutualism, giving back to one another,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. So here we are on Earth Day, and I'm curious, both from your own practice, your research, your indigenous wisdom and training, how might we, given these ecologically challenging times, how might we reimagine or orient to protecting and restoring the health of the natural world? What do you draw on, and from your own mm, tradition and learning, that helps you orient or envision to how do we hold and engage with this immensity that we're facing as a species?
Yeah, I mean, the ideal world, Mark, would be that we start with the children, right? And
Mm,
that we have a few generations polished off that really have a very, very deep respect and understanding and relationship with the earth.
mm,
That is a challenge, in today's culture, the
mm,
fast
mm,
culture we have, children, students, young people, all of us are more likely to go and turn on, a video or sit in front of a screen or something to see, the earth, or to see, a beautiful landscape or whatever. We just don't make our way outside. So I think that's the
mm,
first thing is, a direct, experiential kind of, situations where that's possible to be doing it all the time. But that's the thing now that, I strongly encourage, everyone to do, is that it's our children right now who are going to be dealing with all the mess that we've made, and
mm,
so we have to kind of get them, to be out there to kind of experiencing in the land, to tell stories about the land, and so on. And what we have to do is have this really, clear vision on what we want to happen in terms of our relationship, in the long term relationship. So for me, it's like personally, I've was raised in a lot of stories, narrative stories, traditional stories of my people, and I think that's what people need to go back to: is start a tradition in your family about reading to your kids about preserving the land and relationship that people have with land, and the consequences of when we don't do that. There's a story, and there's several, more than one story, about how my people, the Iroquois people, you know, with in one story they call the foolish boys. Um, they, you know, the tribe was moving along, and these two boys found this really beautiful little snake, which they killed. Right, they killed the snake just because they were being boys. And when the tribal leaders came and looked at it, they said, "Oh no, this is not good. You shouldn't have done that." Right. So they go back to the village, and after that, this whole army of snakes attacks the Iroquois people, and the Iroquois people have this fight with the snakes, for days, and finally they kill a lot of snakes, and the snakes kill a lot of our people, and finally the snakes come to the people and they say, "Let's make peace." And so the elders and the tribe and the warriors said, "Okay, we'll make peace." So they sit down and they have a council with the snakes. They promised. They said, "We will not do this." And the snakes said, "We promise to, have this relationship with you." Now, this is a children's story. right? It's a story about, how what happens, when you do something in a foolish way. There's even, a word for it in my language that says, you don't want this kind of foolish behavior. But these kinds of stories were told to children over and over and over again, in the light of the firelight in the lodge, where the grandfathers and the grandmothers and the aunties and the uncles, or some person who would come in who was a storyteller, would entertain to tell that story, just like all ancient cultures did at one time, to to invest in into the population with a story. That was kind of like the capital, the social capital, was the intellectual capital was all formed around storytelling to kids. So they remembered that, and they were always reminded of that. And then as they got older, they said, "Well, they told us the stories, right? We remember as kids, but now we see it as adults that yeah, there really is, consequence when we don't take care of the planet." So again, I think, for people, storytelling is an ancient. All cultures did it, and we need to do it a lot more in society, right? We need to have these stories happening all the time. Children creating stories, parents creating stories, right? And you know, leaders creating stories and telling those stories over and over again. Because kids are right now are getting, this repeated exposure to, all these different social media platforms. And that's good in some ways because there's good information. In other ways, it's just mindless information. In other
Mhm.
ways, it's harmful information, right? So, that's the thing is that, we it's hard to do. I know it's hard to compete against, these TikTok and Instagram and all these different platforms because kids are all leaning in that direction. And in the creators of that, they want their academic freedom and they want their freedom of speech. So they want all systems to go, whatever sells, right? So that's the challenge that we have right now in the here and now
Mhm.
is, to kind of fight with that kind of thing. So it's that kind of, it's not an easy thing, but I go back to that basic kind of thing, storytelling, and to help, to develop the ethics of young people,
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So one last question, Michael. Any practical steps? So much of your work is around decolonization, mindful decolonization. Any practical steps people can take to incorporate that into their lives, incorporating ancestral wisdom into their lives, particularly that supports social, environmental healing?
Yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of things that I do in my work around practical steps are, I mean, the first step is to begin the investigation of self. It really is. It's like, what's going on inside the brain, what's going on inside the body. Who am I? Right. That's the old one of the oldest sort of things. Comes from Socrates, and everyone's kind of says, that examination of self. It really hasn't changed. I think that's the first thing is, what kind of asking yourself, what kind of relationship do I have with myself? What kind of relationship do I have with the land? What kind of relationship do I have with, gaining knowledge? And that's the first thing is kind of doing that exploration in a big way. And like I said, in decolonization, it's part of scrubbing and purifying ourselves from all these externally sort of enforced ideas and myths and prevarications, of our who we are as human beings. I think that's really a big part of it. So I always say that that's very important to do your own investigation. I find for me the most important thing to do is to begin to do what I call, for me and people I work with, indigenous mindfulness practices, to begin to sit on the land every day, to sit by the river every day, and to develop, a relationship with that land and that river or that forest or whatever it is, and begin to breathe that in, begin to feel its effects, begin to kind of, open to a relationship to it. Like I said, after so many hours of practice, what we know is that we begin to get a stronger and stronger bond with those places, with that experience. I don't think there's too many things that are that powerful that we can do to engage in that kind of contemplative kind of path. So, and it works. It really works. It's pretty clear from all the brain imaging that works. So that's one thing I'd say. And again, uh, every family should write up a meditation practice for their kids and sit down with their kids and write a meditation practice that, what would you say to the tree What would you say to the land? What would you say to the water? If the water was your sister, if the water was your mother, if the tree was your grandmother, how would you, make that relationship? And again, that begins to form, helps the kids form neural pathways in the brain that helps to kind of support that kind of thinking that these things are alive, these things are sentient, these things, are part of, the great circle of life and help me live. We've got this symbiotic relationship. I breathe out the carbon, dioxide, and the trees take that and they give me back oxygen, right? Those are the stories, those are the practices I think that are very kind of practical steps to doing those kinds of things. Storytelling, writing the stories, letting people do the practice, and then moving people in that direction. Kids will, the way memory works is that you know kids will begin encoding that experience. The sight, the sound, the scent, the taste, the touch, and the smell of all that kind of thing. When they do that, that's the first kind of thing that we do, that memory research talks about, encoding. And then they consolidate that experience into, like, well, meditation is consolidated into that. After that, that kind of goes into storage, right? And then they retrieve it every time the story's told. They retrieve that memory every time they sit on the land. They retrieve that every time the song is sung, or the words are read to them. So encoding, consolidation, storage, and memory. It's just the way our memory works as human beings. People have to remember that. That's very, very practical to think about it that way. You want to encode things with kids: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, those kinds of things, right? And then consolidate it in that experience and allow them to retrieve it often when you do the practice.
Well, what a great teaching for Earth Day to go outside, to sit on the land, to sit by water or trees, or and receive the wisdom. So, Michael, thank you so much for being with us today. It's always a delight to talk to you. And I find your work very inspiring, and the integration of indigenous wisdom and neuroscience and nature connection. It's you're really a pioneer in this field. So thank you for your hard work and dedication. And so how can people find out more about you and your work?
I've got a website. It's indigenousmindfulness.com.
Mhm.
Businessmindfulness.com. And if people want to ever work with me or get information from me, they can certainly contact me through my webpage.
Great. Wonderful. Thanks
Yeah.
again, Michael.
All right. Well, thank you.